joined by the STS program from UP Diliman. So welcome to everyone. To just to explain what the Binalot Talks is, this is a weekly informal talk where I guess everyone knows about the brown bags talk. So we bring our lunch every Wednesday and ASP, and then, well, there's a lecture or there's going to be a discussion by an invited guest, and then we have a very informal talk. So because of COVID, we tried to bring this online. But now, because it's online, we try to have it every Wednesday, and then we have it formal. We adjust to the pandemic schedule, I suppose. All right. So, but we're very pleased that this week's talk is co-moderated by Dr. Benji Vallejo from STS, and so may I call on Dr. Michelle Eusebio to please introduce our guest today.
Good morning to all. I first heard about our speaker today, Dr. Kathleen Cruz Gutierrez, when she is guest co-editing with Paul Michael Atienza a special issue on Philippine STS, or Science and Technology Studies, for the Journal of Philippine Studies Historical and Ethnographic Viewpoints. Dr. Kat Gutierrez is Assistant Professor in the Department of History at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where she teaches courses on modern Southeast Asia, the Philippines, science, and the environment. She completed her PhD in Southeast Asian Studies with a designated emphasis in Science and Technology Studies, or STS, at the University of California, Berkeley, as reflected in her dissertation entitled The Region of Imperial Strategy, Regino García, Sebastian Vidal, Mary Clements, and the Consolidation of International Botany in the Philippines, 1858 to 1936. Her other specialties are Philippine History, Southeast Asian Studies, and History of Colonial Botany. Drawing from this dissertation, she is completing a manuscript tentatively titled Sovereign Vernaculars, Philippine Plant Knowledge at the Dawn of New Imperial Botany. Her work and the topic of her talk today perfectly fall into the first module on history and philosophy of science in our STS1, or Science, Technology, and Society 1 course that we teach here in University of the Philippines, Diliman, through the Science and Society program. Specifically, the topic of history of science and technology in the Philippines. The topic very much intersects archaeology and STS, which happen to be the fields that I am both involved with. Hence the reason that I recommended her to the Binalot Talks managers and requested for Science and Society program to co-sponsor this Binalot Talks. We are very thankful to Dr. Rene M. Rollion, our director at Science and Society program, or SSP, and professor at Institute of Environmental Science and Meteorology, or IESM, for agreeing to have the SSP co-sponsor or co-host the Binalot Talks today. We are also very thankful to Dr. Benjamin and Vallejo Jr., who also teaches STS1 and professor at IESM, for agreeing to co-moderate this Binalot Talks. Among us teaching STS1 in UP Diliman, he's the one already specializing in history of science and technology in the Philippines during the Spanish colonial period. Without further much ado, let us hear from Dr. Kathleen Gutierrez.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, and thank you for that generous introduction, Dr. Eusebio. That was great. Just so you all know, it's evening time here, and we have the sunset coming down quick, and I have a very unfortunate glare on my face. So this is going to be my face for a little bit, but that is okay. I'm going to share my screen now. And I did want to say hi to Dr. Maribel Agoo, who's in the audience. Dr. Agoo was my faculty mentor when I was in the field completing this research, and so it's really good to see her here. Hi there. My dad says hi. So good morning all, and thank you for accommodating our time difference by being willing to meet in the AM hour. So it's 7 p.m. here in Oakland, California, and I couldn't be more than pleased to chat with you today about the history of botany in the Philippines, specifically at the end of the Spanish colonial period. So I should first thank RN Anna of the Archaeological Studies program, of course, Dr. Michelle Eusebio, who enlisted the sponsorship of the Science and Society program of the College of Science at UP, and to today's moderators, Anna and Dr. Vallejo. I hope this will be the first of many conversations, and I hope you know that the University of California at Santa Cruz is a willing partner in engaging in these sorts of new intellectual ties. And so I'll start our discussion by sharing a little bit about how I got into studying botany and eventually what led to my dissertation. And from there, I'll share a bit about the dissertation, which is changing considerably for the manuscript revision. And then I'll dive into the paper that I'm drawing from the dissertation, which is what I'm sharing today, Regino García, Artist of Scientific Statecraft. I'll conclude my prepared portion of the talk after sharing from the paper, and we should have ample time for Q&A and for you to share your constructive comments, which I am all ears for. And so I was born in Los Angeles, California, to parents from the Philippines. My mother is from Bulacan, my dad is from Lawag. And prior to my academic career, I had worked in public health among Southeast Asian immigrant communities in California, and had identified the history of public health as my possible avenue for doctoral research. Medicinal plants in particular, as you know, hold a central role in Philippine public health and were my entryway into studying the plant sciences. And so this is an image of the bayabas or guava, which has been promoted by the Philippine state to have excellent medicinal properties, which I've used as an example before in some of my talks. And so I soon discovered in my earliest research how plants were positioned to reify the nation state form, most especially following World War II. So books, for instance, on medicinal plants following Philippine independence emerged to highlight traditions that uplifted the geographical idea of a newly sovereign Philippines. Government scientists insisted on the reality of a new nation by emphasizing all the plants that grew within its boundaries. And this kind of work could help highlight what exactly was uniquely Philippine through the lens of medicinal plants. And so even if the bayabas, for instance, came to the Philippines by way of the Spanish colonial galleons from the Americas, the state could now assert that the plant as its own part of the healing life the Philippine environment could offer. And this was just one of the many introduced species positioned as a Philippine medicinal in works from this time. And so all of this got me thinking, and I found very interesting because of the kinds of ways we imbue meaning in plant life, when, as we know, plants don't have the same loyalties that political projects may pursue. And so this got me thinking about all of the ways in which governments, people, and institutions lay claim to plant life. Botany became a realm of knowledge that I became fascinated with. And really, the totality of the history of science in the Philippines is something that I'm incredibly happy to explore. And so I decided to write a dissertation that looked at colonial botany under both the Spanish and U.S. colonial regimes in the Philippines. I structured the work through the scientific lives of 3 individuals: a Filipino botanical illustrator, Regino García, Spanish botanist, Sebastián Vidal y Soler, and a U.S. plant collector, Mary Strong Clemens. Their lives intertwined show this history of botany in the Philippines at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries that was being responsive not only to local knowledge of plant life, but also impacting the wider imperialist structures of botany at the time, specifically those that were internationalizing in an age of high empire, when multilateral diplomatic systems began to characterize inter-imperial knowledge exchange. So in the dissertation, I argue that regional floristic space, as defined by botanists, became the grounds for inter-imperial intellectual collaboration. And so this image here is of that specific space. And so the full colored part of the image is the Indo-Malayan biogeographic zone, understood presently by its faunal and floral distributions. I was interested in the Malayan, the dissertation, but most especially Malaysia, which is here, comprised mostly of island Southeast Asia and peninsular Malaysia. And so Malaysia is spelled this way, can be pronounced variously. Dr. Ogoo, who's on the call, is also a specialist of this subregion. And so this map in particular ends it at New Guinea, but some definitions of Malaysia include New Guinea. And so this was something that was really the region of my interest in my dissertation. And the full study interrogates how region making through the science of botany was a key strategy deployed by both Spain and the United States to assert imperial intellectual dominance on a global stage. And so now, as much as I loved piecing together the scientific careers of these three people, I will say that the project has launched my curiosity in a slightly different direction, where I'm wanting to peel away from heavy reliance on colonial archival documentation in order to center the role of local botanical knowledge in Philippine history at the turn of the century. So work of Philippine history and the history of science, the manuscript, which Dr. Eusebio mentioned, called Sovereign Vernaculars, centers the role of plant knowledge locally held in the Philippines during the formation of internationalist botany. And in it, I argue that vernacular knowledge of plants enabled political, social, and intellectual possibilities otherwise masked by Linnaean botany. And so while historians of science have investigated the epistemological, linguistic, and commercial violence of imperial botany, I demonstrate how Linnaean norms obscured but never destroyed the generative essence of plant vernaculars, linguistically and otherwise expressed. And I'd love to talk about this more even during the Q&A, because I really don't choose to hold Linnaean botany on any chopping block. I actually think, intellectually speaking, it's very important to think about how Linnaean botany is interacting with local plant knowledge at this time, and to really hold neither one in sort of a more moralizing lens. And I think it kind of generates a much more interesting discussion that way. And so now back to that paper on Garcia. While the dissertation itself will undergo major revisions, I intend to glean a paper from it that highlights Garcia. Garcia caught my fascination during my research. He appears in some popular biographical sketches of important Filipinos in history, but on the whole, his botanical and artistic corpus have been largely overlooked in Philippine historiography, and most certainly in the historiography of imperial botany. But in the paper that I'm developing, I argue that by the late 19th century, Garcia advanced Spain's scientific statecraft as peninsular officials began to exchange colonial botany information with emerging European empires by broadcasting the innovative botanical work conducted in the Philippines. Garcia did so through a visual grammar and artistic ingenuity unseen in other contemporary botanical publications. And by the late 19th century, Spain attempted to refashion itself as an intellectual heavyweight that could stand equal to old and emerging European empires and could recover following its loss of its American colonies earlier in the 19th century. Garcia had an important place in this effort, not only as an employee of the Spanish scientific outfit in the Philippines, but also as its most long-standing, experienced functionary with both botanical and artistic acumen. I primarily examined the book Sinopsis de Familias y Géneros de Plantas Leñosas de Filipinas, translated as Synopsis of Families and Genera of Flowering Plants of the Philippines, written by Sebastián Vidal, illustrated by Garcia, and published by the Comisión de la Flora Estadística Forestal de Filipinas, Philippine Flora and Statistics Commission, as translated, which was tasked with cataloging and surveying Philippine plants. And this was published in 1883. As Rasil Mojares has written, there was no decade in the intellectual history of the Philippines that has been as productive and consequential as the 1880s. Mojares cites several Ilustrado publications from the decade, including Rizal's Noli, the books of Paterno, de los Reyes, and Pardo de Tavera. And to this library, I add Vidal and Garcia's synopsis. I conduct a formal analysis of Garcia's atlas, which is comprised of 100 lithograph plates depicting roughly 1,900 plant figures. By comparing Garcia's illustrations to others he completed on behalf of the Augustinian-backed reissue of Francisco Manuel Blanco's Flora de Filipinas, for which he, the one pictured, was actually the lead illustrator, and other illustrated natural science publications of the time, I demonstrate how Synopsis captures the apex of secular Spanish botany at the end of the 19th century through its visually distinctive and classificatory quality. And this apex was only made realizable through local expertise in the Philippines. Synopsis further enacted a novel mobility for Spanish colonial botany and Philippine plant life through Garcia's artistic techniques. And Synopsis became an intellectual and diplomatic tool to further imperial intellectual undertakings in tropical terrain. And so, who was this person? Well, several of you, okay, maybe will be already familiar with Garcia, but I'll share some biographical details to help situate this person in the second half of the 19th century. And this image here is of his hoja de servicios, which is usually kind of like a resume that people who worked for the Spanish colonial government each received. Because he was born in the Philippines, it was very surprising for this to be located in Madrid. Madrid usually only carried the paperwork of those who were from the peninsula. So it was very lucky to come across this because most of the paperwork we have, or the hojas, were destroyed by fire in the end of the 19th century. And as we very well know, likely decimated during World War II. And so those traces are very hard to find, but this one was just luckily laying in Madrid. And so Regino Garcia was born in Manila on September 7, 1840, to Joaquin Garcia, a Peninsular from Madrid, and Melchora Basa, a Spanish Tagalog from Manila. High social standing ensured young students entry into the established secondary schools of the city, and this was no less the case for Garcia. He was the oldest of 5 children, and the young Regino was primed to study surveying. His parents sent him to the Escuela Nautica in Intramuros, where he obtained training as a land surveyor. And he took to carpentry and metalsmithing quite well, and worked briefly in his late teens in building construction and repair. At around the age of 14, Garcia enrolled at the Academia de Dibujo y Pintura, or the Art Academy in Manila, in 1854 to train formally as a visual artist. In 1866, Garcia was hired by the Jardín Botánico de Manila, or the Botanical Garden, which had been finally established by Spain in 1858 in Manila. The garden had an incredibly slow start. Spain labored to identify a qualified and interested peninsular to take up the directorship. But Garcia began before the first peninsular director arrived, likely to set up the infrastructure for the institution. He had no previous training in gardening, botany, or agriculture, but likely assumed the post because of his skills in surveying. While some of his first evaluations as an employee of the garden suggested that he was pretty unremarkable, he was more highly regarded for his artistic skill. Garcia's talent earned him a place to study in Madrid at the Escuela de Bellas Artes de San Fernando through a pensionado program overseen by the Art Academy. In 1870, Garcia would have sailed to the peninsula ahead of better studied Filipino artists from the second half of the 19th century, like Juan Luna and Felix Hidalgo. But according to one of Garcia's obituaries, political unrest on the peninsula and the death of one of his colleagues, who had also been accepted to the program, foiled his departure. And so he stayed in Manila and resumed studies at the Art Academy and continued employment at the Botanical Garden in order to financially provide for his younger siblings. Spanish colonial botany was really at its most theoretically advanced, with its highest number of employees and with a relatively more considerable funding stream when he was working there. Even though Spanish colonial coffers were notoriously meager, by the end of the 19th century, they were at its most advanced. But what I find most remarkable about Garcia's career in botany is that even if he fell into the field by necessity and circumstance, he ended up carrying the longest institutional memory of secular Spanish botany in the Philippines, because he outlasted all peninsular and most other local employees. The garden's institutional history and that of the Forestry Service, the Inspección General de Montes, is replete with death and employee turnover. Functionaries often only spent a handful of years in the archipelago, either died in the field, retired to the peninsula, and rarely spent the rest of their careers in the Philippines. The Manila-born Garcia, in this respect, had a local's advantage. His family, social ties, and intellectual standing compounded as the leadership of the Garden and Forestry Service changed. He also experienced a professional mobility reserved for an elite few at the time. He learned taxonomy, conventions, plant identifying work, and horticulture on the job. He grew familiar with Philippine plant life and facilitated expeditions to various locales in the archipelago to assist the Spanish scientific outfit. But what also became notable was his reliance on his artful expertise. The art historian, Luciano Santiago, previously described Garcia as part of, quote, an uncommon breed of artist naturalists. And indeed, the end of the 19th century saw a crop of artist naturalists, that is, mostly men who worked in oils and with plants. And this coincided with the reopening and the expansion of the Art Academy where he studied, and of course also the Botanical Garden and Spanish botany. Now, illustrations of the Philippine flora had by no means been absent earlier in the Spanish colonial period. Early modern naturalizing of the Philippines has a visual archive, but many of these were unpublished, used for commercial intents, and remain in tomes and did not circulate widely. But by the late 19th century, illustrated publications on Philippine plants signaled a shift in the way in which the Spanish state exchanged information with other empires. As exemplified through publications produced by the Comisión and functionaries of the Forestry Service, inter-imperial exchange ran in tandem with the intellectual and economic standing the Spanish state hoped to achieve through more extensive botanical research. Illustrated works on the Philippines fashioned late Spanish colonial botanists in a number of ways. And in this sense, illustrations were part of a collective empiricism of which colonial Philippine botanists could see themselves a part. And so during this time in the garden, the Comisión, and eventually with the Forestry Service, Garcia collaborated most closely with Sebastián Vidal. In fact, they were remembered to have a dear friendship, one you can only imagine gets struck when you spend days on botanical expeditions and hours in the herbarium and moments of respite in the garden by each other's side. Vidal has been regarded as Spain's most prolific secular botanist in the Philippines. A Catalan who trained in forestry in Germany, Vidal was deployed to the archipelago in 1872 and had the privilege of having some of his family in Manila too. His brother Domingo also resided in Manila, and some of you might be familiar with Domingo since he oversaw the revision of Blanco's Flora de Filipinas, which sported the illustrations that some of us are more familiar with today. Vidal and Garcia's collaboration not only extended to their expeditions in Luzon and Mindanao, it also included the magisterial work, synopsis, including other catalogs that were likely arranged and supported by Garcia. According to Vidal, the accompanying atlas for this work was its most important part, which could not have come into being were it not for Garcia's industry and enthusiasm. As written in the publication, Garcia completed all of the illustrations and the lithographs, and the atlas's index furthermore indicated that the collecting localities from which all of the illustrated specimens came in order to facilitate verifications, according to Vidal. And so Vidal envisioned the work as a possible guide for future research excursions. And so this was not only an invitation made to peninsular or overseas Spanish botanists, it was one made to a much broader botany community and acknowledged the potential for scientific advancement made beyond the Spanish Empire. Instead of single specimens, however, the images of synopsis feature species and representative plant structures of entire plant families. While it was typical of the synopsis genre in the natural sciences to explore shared characteristics among members of the same taxonomic family, Garcia's visual presentation of plant material was uncommon. For instance, French botanist Ernest Cosson published in 1876 a synopsis on the flora of Paris, a 646-page work with no illustrations. Garcia's style was also unusual of Spanish colonial botany in the late 19th century, and no other colonial contemporary of synopsis offers such a display. And so I'm talking about Spanish colonial botany works made in Guam, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and nothing really matched of this time. And on the peninsula, two major synopses immediately preceded Vidal and Garcia's. An entomological synopsis from 1876 by Ignacio Bolivar, and a synopsis of fossil species in 1878 by Lucas Maliada. And so this is Bolivar's work. So Bolivar's work only featured 7 illustrated plates, and Maliada's work on faunal and floral fossils had only 36. And the plates in Bolivar's and Maliada's publication also present structures arranged in relatively linear, horizontal, or vertical fashion, as you can see here. And this really resembles the presentation of plants in Synopsis Philicum, published in 1883, here on ferns by English botanists William Jackson Hooker and John Gilbert Baker. Fern structures are boxed and segmented by genus, and Garcia's style visually erodes this all together in his own terms of an organization. And so on a single plate in Synopsis, Garcia captures plants' reproductive stages. He combines several species reported as members of the same family of plants, and does so with a lot less linearity of arrangement. And these images present more than just one species for purposes of investigation and comparison, while also demonstrating the classificatory capacity of Garcia, Vidal, and the Comisión. And so artistically, the plates depart from just two-dimensional aspects that had characterized earlier Philippine botanical drawings and even contemporary natural scientific publications. By also skillfully illustrating the structural resemblances within a single family, Garcia presents an updated approach to colonial botany in the Philippines that until that point had either not published thorough images or had ventured to provide only single species illustrations. And so now let's get to these images. So this is one of them. This is Garcia's plate for the Euphorbiaceae family, for example, and it illustrates the structures of species from 8 different genera. So for species A, which is right here in the top middle, Garcia includes an example of a branch in bloom, right here in the middle, an open male flower right here on the upper right-hand side, fruit right here as well, and a cross-section of that fruit right here in the upper left-hand corner, right? The branch is on the center of the page, taking really kind of the visual focus with its enlarged leaves, including one that has been separated from the branch with full view of the leaf's midrib and veins. Garcia captures the inflorescence of other species at a much smaller scale. And so we see that with D1 right here where I have my cursor, G1 as well right here, and then also with H1 right here in the lower right-hand corner. For species B through H, Garcia favors the fruits, flowers, and seeds and separates each species with faint dashed lines. And these largely compose the bottom half of the plate. And he illustrates Cladium javanicum with its fruits along with its cross-section, and this is all in the B area, taking care to include a cross-section of a seed within it. Garcia endeavors to show the reproductive stages of varied specimens by illustrating their seeds, fruits, and in one case even a fertilized flower, which is right here for D3. So you have to pause for a moment and think again of kind of the artistic merits of something like this compared to something like this or something like this, and what kind of ingenuity is coming out of Manila at this time. Most of the plates in synopsis contain an unusual abundance of plant material crowded to the edges of each printed page. And Garcia and Vidal may have done this in part for sensible purposes. Printing an illustrated survey of Philippine plants was costly. This publication of the Spanish colonial forester Ramon Jordana and his 500-page geographic and national sketch of the Philippine archipelago, which was published in 1985, required at least 1,500 pesos for printing in Madrid, and only featured 12 lithographed plates. And this was 150% of the total budget for materials for the Comisión in just 1 year of its operation. Vidal and Garcia also likely chose a local publisher for purposes of proximity and cost. The publisher of Synopsis, Chofre y Compañía, was a popular Manila-based publishing house at the time, producing children's publications, civil reports, and other documents of the commission. With lithography at the Comisión's disposal, Vidal and Garcia could produce more copies of the Synopsis and its atlas at a faster and probably cheaper rate. And by October 1883, at least 106 of the 250 copies planned for peninsular distribution were sent to libraries, research centers, specialized schools, and press houses. Garcia's illustration style could have contributed to the overall lower cost of the Synopsis, which helped make the work more accessible. And printed with no color, Synopsis was not only cheaper to print, but also cheaper to buy. And this, compared to the 4-volume revision of Blanco's Flora de Filipinas, really showed more individual structures and presented botanical classification in a manner unseen in the Blanco work. Flora de Filipinas has been remembered as, quote, the crowning glory of Philippine art and science in the colonial era, end quote, because of its botanical erudition and colonial colored illustrations. In 1876, the Augustinian order in the Philippines initiated the reissue of Flora de Filipinas, which was placed under the editorial purview of Domingo Vidal, who I mentioned. And while the text of the revised edition was printed in Manila, the 477 colored lithographs were printed in Barcelona. The Augustinians paid 73,000 pesos for the entirety of the project, a sum that was more than double the personnel costs of the Comisión in its total 8 years of operations. The flora of the Filipinas was prohibitively expensive for individuals, and its costs especially were evidenced in the sumptuous style of the illustrations and the presentation of plant material on its pages. This is a plate of Ocimum americanum, which exemplifies this, and this was also by Garcia. So centered on the page is a flowering branch, and while the images of Flora de Filipinas do not depart considerably from conventions of natural history illustrations, when compared to the images of synopsis, they reveal an opulence of negative space and color. Remember, this would have costed quite a bit to keep reproducing, and to have this much blank negative space kind of reveals the opulence of the project, whereas we see here kind of a more of an economy of space that we kind of need to take up to reach the edges of the page. And this is really the case for most of the lithograph plates and synopsis. And so even in the absence of color and negative space, Garcia's plates for synopsis utilize considerable technical skill to present organized plant structures in service to plant classification. While cost may have been a contributing factor behind the visual production of synopsis, much merit should be attributed to Garcia's compositional capacity, making the atlas also a work of science and art. This profusion of plant specimens on the plates gestures less toward the financial circumstances of the entire project and more toward the fecund Philippine environment. Compositionally, the plate communicates abundance of both colonial botanical research and plant life in the Philippines, as the structures seem more organically arranged, layered with a depth of field, and are unbound by linear, horizontal, or vertical orientation. The synopsis plates present the Philippine environment as lush and almost overwhelming. They compress plant structures to suggest the environmental wealth that the tropical environment provides. And while the colored plates of Flora de Filipinas present gems of Philippine plant life, they do not do so to spur family-wide investigations that emphasize relations within the Philippine or Malaysian plant world. And this kind of encouragement toward wider investigation of regional and tropical environments continued alongside the publication of synopsis. Now, the synopsis itself was also handsomely rewarded by the Spanish crown, and both Garcia and Vidal were honored for their intellectual product. By the mid-1880s, Philippine botany drew more international acclaim from European botanists engaged in Malaysian study. In 1885, the Italian plenipotentiary in Spain appealed to the state minister for a copy of the illustrated Flora de Filipinas on behalf of Eduardo Becari, a Malaysian palm specialist. Between 1877 through 1889, Becari published a 3-volume study on Malaysian flora drawn from fieldwork he carried out from 1865 through 1878. The plenipotentiary expressed Becari's delight if he were to obtain a copy of Blanco's Flora from the Spanish government and offered Becari's publication, called Malaysia, in exchange. After the state minister communicated the Italian plenipotentiary's appeal, the Ministerio de Ultramar, or the Overseas Ministry, responded directly to the state minister, denying Becari's request for Flora de Filipinas. The Ministerio de Ultramar clarified that the Flora de Filipinas was not a work of the Spanish state, but instead of the Augustinian order. And in its place, the minister offered Vidal and Garcia's synopsis as another work, one funded by the coffers of the Spanish state that was of, quote, no less importance, that could be very useful, end quote, to Becari. While it would be too much to suggest that the Spanish state worked to stifle the inter-imperial circulation of Flora de Filipinas, it was, after all, a very, very expensive set of volumes. Its upholding synopsis as a product of the secular state is telling. The Spanish state's decision to distinguish its intellectual work from the Augustinian publication is therefore curious if we consider how the state may have been responsive to liberal developments on the peninsula and in the Philippines, in addition to the greater anti-clerical outcries emerging from the colony. For botany specifically, Spanish statecraft unmistakably was responsive to scientific developments in the Philippines and worked to incorporate colonial intellectual production in its diplomatic relations with other European empires. It was the botanical initiative conducted in the Philippines that the Spanish state leveraged to present itself to other imperial states as a reinvigorated intellectual power. And in the end, Becari gratefully provided copies of his book, in exchange for synopsis. And now for some concluding. I like to think this triptych of Garcia's work also reveals how the Spanish state refashioned itself as a scientific power relative to emerging empires and to long-standing clerical power in the Philippines. This, as I have shown, was best captured in the publication of Synopsis and Garcia's unique artistic style that gave botany work a distinctive quality compared to other synopses published around the same time. Now, all three of these are by Garcia, and they're all of really the same family of plants or just species, so they're all related. And until the establishment of the botanical garden, the Spanish colonial state in the Philippines lacked the infrastructure to execute wider botanical investigations. And in the triptych, Garcia's rough sketch encapsulates this, and that's the one here on the left. The sketch has not traveled very far from its archival home in the Rizal Library of Ateneo de Manila University. And unpublished, Garcia's sketch bears similarity to the images and botanical data collected by the early Spanish Empire in the Philippines that never met wide publication or distribution. By the late 19th century, however, this changed. The Flora de Filipinas plate exemplifies, this one here in the middle, the meeting of both religious and secular scientific enterprise. But this plate acknowledges that the most significant advancements made in Philippine botany until that point had been at the hands of botanizing missionaries. Even if the state and its secular art school supplied many of the artists to illustrate Blanco's flora, the work was still that of the Augustinians. The synopsis plate here, though, on the right, signals a shift, one that could exemplify the intellectual might of the Spanish Empire accentuated by Philippine virtuosity. A work completed solely by its secular colonial functionaries, the synopsis helped fashion the Spanish state as a scientific one. The synopsis plate communicates to a wider network of plant specialists and relies on a scheme of plant life that recognizes structural resemblances in nature. It encourages observers to visualize plants as part of a fuller relational whole based on taxonomic families that are understood to expand beyond a single colony's borders. The synopsis plate magnifies a fuller sense of regionality, an acknowledgement that plants might bear similarity to others elsewhere and not just within one locality. Synopsis, therefore, contributed to a regional thinking that persisted and developed through the first third of the 20th century, well after the end of Spanish colonialism in the Philippines. So thank you, everyone. I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Ms. Kat. Thank you for that very good talk. I think we might have some questions. And we might have some other comments from the crowd. But that was a very interesting talk from the perspective of using the visuals on how to illustrate the powers, I think, I would say, or the capacity or the intellectual capacity of the people during Spain. I think Dr. Vallejo is also interested in that time. Am I correct, sir?
Yeah. Well, very interesting because you're dealing from the botanical. I've been working on the zoological side now. Especially important is the role of the secular scientists that are employed by the colonial government to document the biodiversity of the Philippines, and I think that started around 1850s. For the zoological and the marine biological side, that was taken on by the Oceanographic and Hydrographic Service of the Spanish Navy. So there are similar plates in zoology to what was presented, okay? But there's one interesting difference that I noted here. The botanical plates are so crowded as compared to the zoological plates. And it might have to do something with the economic importance. At that time, probably the plants were considered to be more economically important than what the marine zoologists were collecting in the Philippine archipelago. So that struck me very well during the presentation. I've seen some of the plates of Vidal, okay, and Regino, and but not the whole entirety really. So I think that's quite interesting, and I think one of the major drivers for the Spanish putting a lot of investment, time, and effort for biodiversity documentation is they wanted to catch up with the British at around that time. Okay, especially when the first British oceanographic expeditions began sailing, like the HMS Challenger. Okay, so the Spanish were trying to catch up, which is the context for all their work in this part of the world.
Did the Spanish also so did the British also make the similar plant researches during that time?
I think they were doing a lot. eh, But the Philippines was not, because it's a Spanish colony, they were doing it more on the Malay Peninsula. Uh, but for the zoological side, they were already collecting in what the Philippines now claims as part of its territory, the West Philippine Sea. The British were already collecting there. That's why the Spanish had to catch up with it's projecting their soft power or naval power in the South China Sea. So they started documenting also the biodiversity there. So I think that's one thing that needs more research. This interplay of the botanist and the zoologist in natural history, collecting all of these things with a geopolitical interest, really.
Yes. I,
Yeah.
this is something. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, I would agree. I think I think you bring up a really good point about the British. And the British were interesting bedfellows, intellectual bedfellows with someone like Vidal. Vidal was much more itinerant as a Spanish colonial botanist in the Philippines. In fact, so much of his career was really kind of representing colonial botany in the Philippines internationally. And so he, praised Bentham and Hooker. He acquired a lot of books from England to bring back to the Philippines to actually populate the libraries at the Botanical Garden. And so intellectually, I think there was a connection, but you're absolutely right. I think the Spanish Empire on the whole, definitely back in Spain, was flagging well behind the natural science expeditions of the British Empire. And what's unique, and I love your point about economic plants. The one thing that I found really interesting about Synopsis is that they don't really expand on the economic potential of plants. There are other catalogs that do it, definitely from the Forestry Service, but it's not quite that work. It's really much more descriptive. It's a bit more taxonomic, but Vidal was absolutely producing it. And so you're right. The Forestry Service is really interested in timber, lumber at this time. But what I also love is sort of theoretical engagement that I think Garcia and Vidal both tried to get into. And I think I also remember finding a couple of archival bits on zoologists who were working with them specifically for the Madrid exposition. So we can chat, Dr. Vallejo, about a little bit of that, and maybe I could share some of that documentation with you, because they were also kind of collaborating. They're all in the same city, no?
Yeah, and there are also important further directions for this kind of research. For instance, there's a lot of work done by the secular Spanish botanists and zoologists here. They wanted to test Darwin's theory as seen through a Spanish lens, because Darwin was translated into Spanish from French. So there must be the cultural context of the translation of the Origin of Species. It came from French, and later on it was directly translated from English into Spanish. So these are the works that were obviously were taught to Rizal, Antonio Luna, and all of the other ilustrados when they were attending Universidad Central de Madrid. So definitely how these things develop, probably they consulted botanical plates. I'm sure Rizal was familiar with that, especially Antonio Luna, who was trained as a pharmacist, are very much familiar with all of these developments. So these documents here reflect a direction for the development of Darwinian theory as seen through Hispanic eyes, and probably it influenced also the Latin American republics, which were influenced by, which were former colonies of Spain, with also high biodiversity.
Right, right. And I think you're right. I mean, and one can't, avoid Darwin and sorts of analyses of natural scientific publications from this time. What's curious is that Vidal didn't acquire the Origin of Species for the Manila Library. So we don't really have a catalog of it getting to the Philippines by the 1870s for them to have relied upon. And so the work itself doesn't really start to reflect developments in evolutionary systematics or evolutionary biology. And so that comes a bit later. And so, I haven't quite pieced together what the theoretical attachments may have been. And I think you're absolutely right. There's almost a bit more of a French bias in some of the earlier secular botany. But at the same time, I think, had that work been acquired, had it made its way to the Philippines with Vidal, I think it would have been, more developed, certainly in some publications.
Well, the Spanish translation of the Origin of Species is in the UST Benavides Library. So definitely it arrived in the Philippines. Now, whether the UST students were able to read it is a very interesting question.
But when was it acquired by in UST?
That was acquired during as soon as it came out in Spanish translation, most likely, because the Dominicans were really up to date. They were building up their faculties of pharmacy and medicine. So definitely they were getting the latest books from Europe.
That's interesting. And I think we have some questions.
No, just to add to what Benji's saying. First of all, thank you very much, Dr. Gutierrez, for sharing your research, and very fascinating. And but just to go straight to my view about, let's not forget they had an index, no? The friars, well, there are illegal books, no, or the black, and they get confiscated as they arrive or get confiscated in their homes, but they don't get burned. So maybe it's in the UST library because later on they integrated it. But for most of its life, during the Spanish period, they were under lock and key. And maybe some of them managed to read it, some of the Dominican friars, but most of them will not even want to touch it. And that is I think the paradox of the Philippines, Kat. You mentioned earlier the problem of vetoing the purchase of Blanco's the latest version publication in favor of the synopsis, right? I don't think it's just simply the cost. Perhaps if we look deeper into it, it is by the nature of the politics of Spain at this time. Maybe at the moment that this request was asked, it was the government locally and maybe back in Spain was in conservative hands. That swing, the classic swing after the 1812s in Spain of politics, and that cannot be overemphasized in the way it affected us. And on top of that, we were it's beyond propaganda to say that the church was more in control of the dispersal of knowledge and the teaching of the locals. They were more in control. So no matter what, there were 3 or 4 attempts in UST to modernize the teaching of science, but they will just smile, and sabotage any effort until it becomes conservative again. That is the nature of the history of the teaching of science and in the Philippines. I am fascinated by your thesis or your narrative of looking at the plates of Garcia and associating it with with the landscape, so the clustering, it's jam-packed, you went beyond saying that, well, it's more economical to do it that way, but it's so artistic. I just want to clarify, are you doing a metaphor, or are you really doing a larger or deeper symbolic connection between the way Garcia was presenting the botanical features in the plates that he was making? So in other words, I just want to know, are we beyond metaphor here?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I love the commentary. And, you caught I'm so glad that you caught on to something that I zoomed through in the interest of time, which was this question about thwarting the trade of that Flor de Filipinas for Beccari's Malaysia. And I do think you're absolutely right. There's the fracture of politics and religion that's absolutely finding its way onto the peninsula. There's a kind of the reverberation, right, of the tenuous place that the peninsula is in at this time politically, the tenuous place that the Philippines is in at that time politically. It's much more than just a cost issue, I think. And it's also about how is, the Spanish state kind of insisting that it has some clout in the realm of science, finally, compared to the Augustinians, for instance, and the other orders that had just been prosecuting the work for so much longer. And as you're saying too, this kind of oscillating of conservative and liberal contents that are making that trade much more salient in its importance for what it's doing with Italy, for instance, that's just starting to emerge on the imperial scene, right? So thank you so much. I get to clarify that a little more. I think I'm trying to interpret these images in a number of ways. I think that's maybe the heart of having a bit of a humanistic lens in this, both in sort of its practical scheme, but then also for, you're right, this sort of symbolic essence and what kind of artistic decision-making Garcia was making. This could have been one to show kind of the Philippine environment in a particular way. I think is how one way one can look at it. I kind of look at it as a bit of an invitation, in sort of a scientific and taxonomic way. How does one look at all of these plants together and then feel kind of compelled to make sort of further descriptive or taxonomic studies of what they're seeing? And then, of course, the more formal analysis. How is this actually distinguished from other publications of its time? And I think all work quite well in sort of that interpretation. But I think in the whole, as a work of intellectual history, I am having to put the publication sort of in its time, understanding how Spanish colonial botany is working at the end of the 19th century. So I don't go fully in sort of to that humanistic metaphorical analysis, although I think that would be great terrain for another art historian to do. If I knew more about art history, I think I would do it.
Well, for me, it's interesting because you're diving deep into the life of this individual. For example, did his library survive? How do we have access to what he had? The classic ways of looking at intellectual histories of individuals. Second, what did he do during the revolution? Do we know? Did he become a Katipunero, or was he loyal to Spain, like many of them, in 1896, and only later on will join, right, in 1898? Do we know anything about that part of his life outside his? Because he died in 1916, so then of course the Americans came, and was he then integrated? But he was too old, of course, by the time. So, but was he tapped by the Bureau of Science, for example, in the early days?
Definitely.
Questions about it.
Oh no, I'm so happy. These are the other parts of the paper that I just simply couldn't expand yet. Although, I'm trying to figure out where this might find its way in, if anything, if I try to develop anything more biographical about him, because I think his political life is really something to consider. And you're absolutely right. You just sort of charted that trajectory that some intellectuals at this time followed. So no, he didn't join in 1896. He did remain loyal to Spain. He joined in 1898. So he joined Aguinaldo. He was part of kind of the revolutionary service that was engaged in creating trenches in particular. Sort of there's talk of this revolutionary forestry service that I wouldn't doubt he had a hand in, but he defected from that eventually and joined the United States colonial government. And so he worked for a number of years, really assisting the transition government. I mean, as really the kind of the main individual linking these two institutions. And this is why in the dissertation, I kind of try to blur 1898 when it comes to this kind of notion of the intellectual fracture between the colonial periods, because you have local figures like Garcia who are actually creating that continuity that the United States absolutely needed. He only worked for a few years. He was absolutely disparaged by the United States. He was called many things kind of incorrectly in the archives. He was called sort of a dumb old Spanish, functionary. He didn't know much. He was uneducated. He didn't really have very good facility identifying plants. He just sort of lingered. And I think this was very kind of incorrect. You know what I mean? I take this as sort of a the historian's hubris in this. But I think, that was more indicative of kind of the way that U.S. scientists were perceiving Spanish science at the time. And Garcia gets really folded into that.
It's
so
hard to believe, given the detailing of his illustration.
Unbelievable, right?
He memorized that, and he did it again, so he knew his botany, definitely.
Right. So he knew his plants, he knew his plant structures, and he was still writing. I mean, we have sources that suggest he was writing pseudonymously for certain papers on plants and trees. I think I may have found some, but they're not without bylines. Eventually he was overseeing estates, before his death. And so he had a very long career. And so his, kind of biography alone is kind of a sign of its time, especially if you look, like I said, at other intellectuals like Pardo de Tavera. We don't know where a lot of his library went, but we know that some of it did go to Pardo. So it's in the Pardo reading room at the Rizal Library where I found the original sketches. Stuff is sort of scattered, but it's very, very minimal.
You were quiet about Pardo de Tavera and on your point about people who are using plants. I think there was your discussion with Benji. I think that's why there was the development, I think, of economic botany, because there was much later on a much strong force, right, or interest in the relationship of plants and people rather than the botany itself, right? Different. I think Garcia is more of the botany, and that Pardo de Tavera and company are of the economic botany type. No?
Yeah, and I think, and there's a good amount of scholarship that's been done on that work, especially on medicinal plants, ethnobotany, or at least the people who are writing on ethnobotany. I've stayed very interested in the people engaging in the more theoretical work, so that includes Garcia. It also includes Blanco, but I don't really go that far back in my own work. I'm a specialist of sort of the more religious naturalists or the missionizing naturalists. But I should do a shout out to Dr. Madulid, who's on the call, who is the specialist of the missionizing naturalist.
Dr. Madulid did a lot. Just clarification, I bought a reprint of Father Galende's time, of the Blanco. No? I sold my kidney to get but I noticed in your plates of Blanco, you had a dark number on the right-hand side, no? But on this facsimile that was reprinted, right? I think this is was this the 1880s one, if I remember right? The last reprint, right? I think this is the expensive one.
1870s to 1880s, yeah.
The 75,000 pesos you mentioned, right? Yeah, because it's the Barcelona print. But your plates had a dark number.
Yeah, mine was simply from where I got the image. So, depending on like the repository where you go, if you get it from like the Biblioteca Digital from the Botanical Garden in Madrid, sometimes it has the images. I think like Dr. Madulid's version has the much cleaner image where it's not soiled by stamps.
Okay. So I was thinking maybe it was a much older or a much later version of.
Oh no! It's just an accession number, I think, and stamp.
It was just a stamp.
Yeah, for pagination. But yeah, and those images in and of themselves, again, they're very artistic. They're noted again because Garcia was also the main artist for this, and many of his compatriots who were training in Manila, and they're fascinating. And I also think it's a very distinct and different project from what's happening with the synopsis.
Okay, let me read some of the comments on the chat box.
Sure.
Okay, okay, this is from Dr. Michelle Eusebio. Perhaps the integration of colonial botany and archaeobotany is an opportunity to confirm origins, introductions, and timing of many plants like fruits and vegetables in the Philippines, like were some of them really introduced to the Philippines by the galleon trade. Do the plates, the studies of the Regino and Vidal y Soler allude to that, the timing of the introduction of these crops from the Americas?
So, yeah, sorry, I wanted to also add because to what Dr. Vallejo was saying and Dr. Michelle was also added here in the chat that there was also the clarification regarding the guava because he also mentioned that it was part of the galleon trade, but there's a 14th to 15th century burial site that has the guava in Bolinao.
Oh, that's exciting. I love that. Yeah, I have to say that my reference for that was through Dr. Madulid too. So I would love to hear, Dr. Madulid, who's, much more of a historical botanist and tracing the arrival of particular plants. Vidal and company were interested somewhat in this, but I would say that again, these appeared really much more with kind of the more economic inventories. It was less so the case all the time incorporated in some of the descriptive works. But they were not engaged in kind of that historical botany. Although I think, combining the methods of archaeobotany are really important, especially to Southeast Asian studies. I've kind of always had this dream of tracking that. And I know some people are doing some great work on the Philippines and rice varieties in this. But, I would love to hear from the folks. So guava, and so this is from you, Dr. Eusebio. You said that the archaeological find finds guava in the Philippines from the 14th to the 15th centuries.
Well, actually, no, it's not actually from me. Someone brought this up. So yeah, probably because Cervic is Dr. Paz is actually one of our pioneer archaeobotanists in the Philippines. Perhaps you can clarify that, Cervic.
Yeah, it's
the find in Bolinao, was that?
Yes, it was a National Museum excavation, a very good excavation. They found it inside a Kern burial, and it's been published in the Philippine Journal of Science, the technical one, the botanical technical identification of the guava remains. It's almost desiccated, like quasi-desiccated form. At the beginning, I was suspicious about it, but reading the papers, it was quite. They were very careful about it, very careful in the identification. And given the context of it inside the kern, it's like a kern inside the kern, and it was in a earthenware in a plate, silver plate or earthenware plate. I'm trying to recall now. Yeah, so that opens up the idea that which now is more acceptable, but before it wasn't, that there were much earlier, we must not underestimate the interaction that was going on. And guava may have come early, just like sweet potato may have come earlier than expected, right? Than in a different route than the coming of the Spaniards. So,
yeah, I love that. I think that that's great. I mean, I think that just, again, opens up further investigation, really kind of relying once more on additional methods, that are not typically accessible to historians, right? Especially if we're relying on registers that show particular trade of arrival of botanical products. So I think that that's amazing. Thank you for citing that.
Can I just say then, anyway, now that I'm talking, and that your point about the the Linnaean binomial system not being, it's not going to destroy or replace a local discourse on plants, right, is very valid, and it's good that you underscored that, right? They are, I think it fits well your point, your larger statement at the beginning of your talk, that the botany, or the study of plants, became a language to connect regions, right? Regions, be them colonial governments or people are interested in plants across regions. And that is the role of the Linnaean binomial. And let me, because Dr. Madulid is here and people are not aware of it, this is the publication that actually manifests what you're saying. No, so this is the binomial, and then from here you can it takes you to the local, to the vernacular names, right, per ethnolinguistic group, which then gives you the binomial. So depending on who you're talking to, right? So let's say you're working in a locust region, then you know what they're called. But then if you want to talk to your colleagues at Berkeley, for example, then you use the binomial to talk to them. So it depends on so that's a wonderful thing about it.
Yeah,
we still have to know more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and this is where, I think a lot of my learning and perspective around this came from actually also working with Dr. Go, where, some of the impulse around training in the United States, especially if you study things like empire and colonialism, tend to fashion things like colonial science in a way that almost centers the narrative on all of the things that it does, while kind of obfuscating all of the things that persisted and were actually very, very dynamic. And like I mentioned, there's been a focus, for instance, on like the linguistic imperialism of Linnaean taxonomy. And while sure, I think those studies definitely have some credence to them, I think by focusing on that, you actually start to not look at all of the ways that vernaculars have been so much more dynamic, very, very interesting, if not elastic, if not continuous and enduring, in ways that I think when you put in perspective to Linnaean taxonomy, kind of shows how young Linnaean taxonomy is and how kind of small the group of users it actually maintains is as well. And I like that. I think like looking at that comparison is important. And I don't think putting them in competition with one another or intense contradistinction to one another is a really useful project, because I think it does a disservice to how intellectual projects were working on at the time, especially for people like Garcia, who could work in the vernacular very plainly. And there's documentation of how he was doing this, especially with rice varieties. And he had access to that I think Spanish colonial botanists simply didn't. And so that in and of itself shows a very neat kind of liminal space where all of that is interacting. I see in the chat there are lots of questions.
There's a question, going on to that, there's a question here. So where are the Indios in all these scientific ventures? So I guess you can also expand on the concepts of language and adding that. So
Sure, yes. Well, I will say that the colonial documentation is slim, and I think that's where my manuscript project is trying to do a little bit differently, and that's really a methodological problem and question I'm trying to solve, but I'm happy to talk about that. When I think about this particular project that I looked at, I would say that if we looked for Indios, it would probably be more as collectors and guides. We have some images from the time that really point to the reliance on local guides. Who assisted Vidal, who assisted people like Merrill completely. Oftentimes, sometimes they were referred to directly, wasn't always consistent. And as we know, some of the most kind of prestigious ranks in Spanish colonial government were not held by Indios, right? These were generally mestizo identifying people or identified people. But at the same time, I think this is not a closed case. When you think about history and just having different methodological tools, I think we can actually work towards finding more of that Indio population. So one way that I'm trying to do this is by looking at weaving technologies. And so plants used for weaving and dyeing at the turn of the century. These were mostly knowledges held by female actors, a lot of them not necessarily mestizo identified or mestiza identified. But if you look at the tools, if you look at the logs, I think there's a way to kind of bring out that knowledge that was held by them. I think looking at rice varieties and the different nomenclature used in the 19th century can point to local knowledge in a different way. And so while it would be lofty for me to suggest that I could find the voices of Indios when it comes to plant life and botany, I don't think it's impossible to find how those knowledges were creeping into the records we do have. But I'd love to hear more ideas around how folks are also doing this methodologically in their work.
And there's another question here from PJ De Macali. So, have there been any investigations done on the printing technologies used for these various plates and how these technologies might have impacted their production and dissemination? So he's just curious about the communications technology aspect.
Yeah, oh, I love it. That's such a great question. So also something I didn't include in the talk for sake of time. So that publishing house, Chofre y Compañía, they had their own lithography machine. And so that was brought to the Philippines, and that made that process so much more easy. I mean, again, the project didn't have to be partially printed in Spain. And so by having the technology local, having the expertise with someone like Garcia, who could actually do the lithography, which is pretty painstaking work, made that printing much more feasible and again, much more affordable. So you're right. I mean, I think technology couldn't be avoided in a question like that. And just to answer a separate question, in case it wasn't clear, on the sheets themselves for, as crowded as they are, these are different species. So some of them are labeled differently by letter for different species within the family. But oftentimes, again, it was even multiple genera, sometimes on the same plate. In case that wasn't clear, I know that came up in a private question.
Because it's interesting how they were also, like you mentioned, crowding all of those drawings, but choosing which type of species to put in the similar page, that was already also a good question for the illustrators and also the biologists that they were working with.
Right.
There's an addition from EJ Bulata, and I think Dr. Vallejo also addressed this. To add to guava discussion, Jose Honorato Lozano's 1847 painting album commissioned by Gervasio Gironella featured the bayabas illustration among other fruits. Interestingly, he labeled it as guayabas, an agglutination of guava and bayabas. And which, Dr. Benji, you mentioned that it's the common name of the endemic chunky parrot. So is this a connection? This is a good connection between the plants and the animals.
No, because the guayabero is eating bayabas. Kaya that's why it was called guayabero. So it's eating the small bayabas. So I think we have two in UP Diliman flying around. Sometimes I've spotted it near the ASP.
Oh, that's really cute. Do we have a guava there? The bayabas in
Probably around the neighborhood.
Yeah, for sure there are guava trees scattered around UP.
It's interesting that the animal, when you're describing animals, it's also in association with the plants that they are eating. So in some ways, there's also this, besides defining what are the animals that are there, you're also then defining the environment that these animals are working in. So it's such by using the names, then you're already describing the environment already of the people. Is this a local term, the guyabero?
Yeah, I think it's Tagalog. I don't know. I think in other regions it's also called like that.
Or Tagalay Spanish, probably. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, and I think of it too as sort of a reminder of how nomenclatural practices, that maybe not are Linnaean, are very multi-species or can be very multi-species in the way that they develop, right? So you imagine the guayabero with bayabas, or guayabas nearby, right? At least in the kind of, even the cosmology or the imagination of a particular person that's working with these different plant names or even faunal names. And that again, just points to perhaps a different perception of plant life or of the natural world that isn't necessarily based on morphological similarity or relationship. Again, I don't usually weigh one as better than the other, but I think both are very fascinating when they're distinguished.
Yes, Dr. Paz, you were going to say something?
Yeah. Are you pursuing more, thinking more about the botanical gardens and its sociological, anthropological role in all of this, in your interest, in the history of, so you went deeper into that too, no? So I'm not, is the one in Arroceros, is that the first one of our botanical garden? That was the first one, no?
Well, it was the one that was effectively established. So there were other attempts, to create a garden, and this, dated back centuries. But I would say that the first that the Spanish government really was able to execute was the one in 1858. Others were kind of at the helm of some of the private organizations in the Philippines. The 1858 one around Arroceros, which was terribly placed, always flooded.
And it looks like a formal French garden rather than like a like a technical like a illustrative or a teaching garden, right? So
Yeah,
I mean, so that then goes to the problem of how do you define a botanical garden?
Sure. I mean, I'm going to share my screen here because it's just so fancy doing it. And I can. So this is a plan of the Jardín Botánico de Manila. This was in Spain. This is in Madrid. And so this is what we have of really what Arroceros would have looked like. And you're absolutely right. It looked a little bit more like a pleasure garden that one would kind of have leisure time at in the Philippines, or that they would have in Paris. The Havana garden was very similar to this. But I will say that even if a lot of the impulse had been to beautify this space, which was what Norsagaray, the Governor General at the time, was interested in, when people like Vidal, Domingo, Jordana came in, these were all Spanish foresters or botanists, they were really reforming this place. And so originally, again, it was a beautifying space. It was supposed to teach agriculture more so. It became more of a research garden. And so it started exchanging materials and plant seedlings with other nearby gardens. Unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot on what sort of it was maintaining, but some of what Madrid has does give us some registers. And so, yeah, so we see this here, but I say that it was terrible because it was flooded regularly by the Pasig. It was just fetid. Nothing could survive. And so it was very poorly chosen. So even if it was chosen to beautify, it was not really adequately chosen as a research space. And in fact, there were some discussions to move this further north into a suburb of Manila, of Intramuros, just in order to sustain it. But oh yeah, it was just the butt of jokes in the end of the 19th century because it was awful.
Has anyone written a academic paper on it, on the botanical gardens? I don't know if Dr. Madulid has, but have you read any on this?
I mean, I think my little, I don't know, the first chapter of my dissertation is on this. So it's an institutional history.
Well, you really publish that. Will be you're sure to have at least some readers here.
I hope for at least 2. Then I'll feel successful. But no, I'd love to. And part of it's because the garden's history, I think, hasn't really been well known. I think some of this is because the history of US colonial botany has had much greater precedence in the historiography. Spanish science has been very ridiculed in some capacity. And there's just been so much destruction of local archives that even that alone hasn't really been well remembered. And so when you look at what does exist about that garden, it was fascinating. I mean, it was absolutely making changes that were responsive to theoretical developments in science, that were responsive to liberal changes in Spain in the 1860s, and that were recognizing that they needed to hire qualified people to work this garden. And so Manila was still in this constellation of natural scientific work. And so, I'd be happy to share my dissertation with you.
No,
if you
just write the article out of it. Just so we'll
I know it'll be better. It won't have as many typos when I write the article.
because we've excavated, our community has excavated at least in 3 places here, right? And and the botanical garden phase is, we just go through that, and we don't know, we don't plot it even or whatever, right? And but we know it was there, and because we have, in fact, that's the cover of our journal, right? And yeah, it's a report of one of the excavations. So we know those are tobacco factories, by the side.
Yeah.
And now our colleagues from the National Museum are excavating Chinese tombs in near the Met, the Metropolitan Theater, which was again part of the botanical garden. So it would be fantastic if we can fine-tune our knowledge of the botanical garden, so that when we excavate there, and we will excavate there again, we can then fine-tune our excavation techniques.
Absolutely, yeah, and I'd be happy to share whatever archival documentation I found, including old logs of what was growing on the grounds, or at least what had been anticipated to grow. And I'm sure you can kind of help clarify this with some of your findings as well. And it's telling because not all of it was for economic use. And some of, there were a lot of trees, but there were also some medicinal plants, but it was quite varied. And I think, again, it shows a little bit more dimension to what the Spanish state, or at least the colonial Philippine government, had been interested in too. And so
the flooding would have killed them, most of them.
All of them. It's just terrible. I laugh, but it was, over and over again, I think that was the concern of this location for the decades that it did exist. And at some point, the whole garden was destroyed in the 1890s. There was a terrible fire that ran through the library. And so it's unfortunate because that's where we would have actually had more of the information on local employees, potentially a lot more of the students who may or may not have been mestizo, who maybe came from other parts of the Philippines, because we know that the school that was established tried to train young men from other parts of the archipelago to come to Manila and then kind of distribute botanical practice elsewhere. And so all of that's gone, unfortunately, but I think sometimes we're lucky in finding other kind of straight road documents. And thank you so much also, Dr. Eusebio, for sharing my dissertation. There's so many typos, oh my God.
Well, it's normal in dissertations anyway, when you...
Show me one that doesn't have any typos.
There's a question here from Lisa Ito, and perhaps this is going to be the last question before we close the talk. As an art history researcher, I find your dissertation a very important and exciting work for the history of visualizing flora in the country. As a rare and good example of an artist naturalis, did Regino Garcia's practice change later on as he continued his work during the American colonial period under Elmer Drummond?
Oh, such a good question. Thank you. Honestly, in my appraisal of it, I don't think the U.S. colonial government or the Bureau of Science really knew the kind of skill that they had. And so he was not producing. I haven't been able to find necessarily any major sketches, nothing of this detail post 1898. Potentially, he could have still been producing, but nothing that's existed, and certainly nothing that's been published. He was writing a little bit. We know this, but he wasn't able to prosecute the same level of research. My suspicion is that he wasn't really entrusted to go into that level of research under US auspices. I think he was absolutely a guide. I think he provided a lot of institutional information, but I just don't think he was really as highly regarded by the time the United States rolled in. And so I can't say that his practice was really any more visible in any work that we have around. But if we find something, I'll definitely be in touch, Lisa, about it.
Because this publication was also distributed to other places, or otherwise the American people were not aware of the works, or would they perhaps have known about the publication of this work, Yeah.
They would have, and I think certainly they knew of Vidal. So I think Vidal was the most highly regarded by the Americans. Merrill was fond of Vidal's work. I think he of found the Vidal brothers on the whole, the more industrious of the Spanish at the time in the 19th century. Somehow Merrill, and other US botanists are kind of disaggregating Garcia from Vidal, but if you read back really through some of Vidal's major publications, stuff that was published posthumously because Vidal died very young in the Philippines, they almost couldn't be separated. You kind of actually get the suspicion that their intellectual output was enhanced because they worked together. And Garcia actually published some of Vidal's collections or about them after he died without byline or credit either. And so interestingly, I think by the time the Americans come in, they start to really kind of peel them away from one another, and they don't see that intellectual project almost needed to happen together to be as great as it was.
And that's also a fascinating part. So we talked about the ethnobotany and the botanical, the animal side of it, but there's also the very humanistic side of it. The relation, instead of just the relationship between plants and animals, humans and plants, humans and animals, there's also the part that is intrinsically, there's the human part of it, because people need other people or other intellectuals, other people to talk about and to think about things instead of simply just thinking about it individually. They always need someone to help lift them up, I guess. So that's a very nice, I guess, story, and also a good way for everyone of us to remember that collaborations is also very important.
Collaboration. I think Kat should collaborate with Carabin Kison, who gave a talk with us. You know of Carabin Kison, right? Because you were mentioning earlier that's the direction you want to go through to, and she knows a lot about weaving and plants that are used for weaving.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like that's important. Sorry, I see your guest behind you. Yeah, no, absolutely. I've worked a little bit. I've only kind of been a fan of Kison's work from afar, but I'm more familiar, and I've worked with Dr. Salvador Amores, who has kind of been my mentor, back in Manila, or rather in Baguio too. So it's just nice to know that people are around that again are thinking, I think, methodologically creatively about this kind of work. And to go back to that humanistic point, maybe as just something to close, I think so much heart kind of goes into writing a scientific biography, and sometimes it's hard to kind of capture feelings, impulse, intention in colonial archival documentation. But absolutely, I think like if I could write to just the level of dedication that I know that many of these folks had committed to the scientific world and craft at this time, then I feel like I'm doing some good work, in the history of science in the Philippines.
Oh, that's definitely good work already, but you can add more. That's a nice thing about it, and more collaborations as well, because we're very lucky that there's technology now. So we have the capacity to also talk despite the distance. So that's really, and very quickly too. And all right. Thank you so much and with that, we will end this talk. Thank you to Dr. Kat Gutierrez. Thank you to Dr. Ben Vallejo, to Dr. Michelle Eusebio, and of course, Dr. Paz, and all the people who stayed to listen and who watched the Binalot talk and also ask questions. So next week, we will have the talk will be at 1 p.m. already, and it will be given by Dr. Janine Ochoa, the title of her talk will be Ang Mga Buot ng Kalaw, Extinct Fossil Cloud Rats of Northeastern Luzon, which was recently published alongside ASP's Dr. Mijares' work in Kalaw Cave. So please join us next week at 1 p.m. Again, thank you to SDS for helping us out, and for the Dr. Benz, who's gave a lot of insights. Hopefully, to complete the questions regarding plants, you can also add in more animals, and eventually we will have more insights about the Spanish colonial histories, the biological histories of the Philippines and other parts of the island Southeast Asia. So thank you so much to everyone. Thank you, and we'll see you again next week. Thank you, Dr. Kat, for
Thank
that
you.
wonderful, wonderful talk.
Let's please be in touch. Thank you so much for your time, everyone.
Of course. Thank you. We'll give you some emails and we'll keep you in touch. We will keep in touch as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.